Chapter 5 The Dependence of Royalty on Priesthood. Let us now direct our attention to the relationship between the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas in the social organization of India. To the Kshatriyas normally belongs outward power, since the field of action, which concerns them directly, is the external and perceptible world. But this power is nothing without an interior principle, a purely spiritual one, that incarnates the authority of the Brahmins and in which it finds its only real guarantee. We see here that the relationship between the two powers could still be represented by that between the interior and the exterior, a relationship that in fact symbolizes well that between knowledge and action, or, to put it differently, between the mover and the moved, taking up again the idea we explained above in reference to Aristotelian theory as well as Hindu doctrine. It is from the harmony between this interior and exterior, a harmony moreover that must not be conceived of as a kind of parallelism which would imply an ignorance of the essential difference between the two domains, that there results the normal life of what can be called the social entity. By the use of such an expression, we do not mean to suggest any sort of comparison of the collectivity to a social being, especially as certain people have abused this notion in the strangest way in recent times, mistaking what is merely analogy and correspondence for a true identity. In exchange for the guarantee of power by the spiritual authority, the Kshatriyas must use this power to ensure that the Brahmins will have the means to peacefully accomplish their proper function of knowledge and teaching, sheltered from trouble and agitation. This is what is represented in Hindu symbolism by the image of Skanda, Lord of War, protecting the meditation of Ganesha, Lord of Knowledge. It should be noted that the same thing was taught, even outwardly, in the Western Middle Ages. Indeed, St. Thomas Aquinas expressly declares that all human functions are subordinated to contemplation as their superior end, so that when considered properly, they all seem to be in the service of those who contemplate the true raison d'être of the entire government of civil life, fundamentally lying in the assurance of the peace necessary for their contemplation. One sees how far this is from the modern point of view, and also how the predominance of a tendency to action, as it incontestably exists among Westerners, does not necessarily bring about the disparagement of contemplation, that is, of knowledge, at least so long as a people possesses a civilization of traditional character, whatever form that tradition may take, which in the context cited was religious, whence the theological nuance of that St. Thomas always attached to contemplation, whereas in the East the latter has always been envisaged in the order of pure metaphysics. On the other hand, the Hindu doctrine and the social organization that is its direct application, and therefore among a people where a contemplative attitude understood in the sense of pure intellectuality is manifestly preponderant and even generally developed to a degree found perhaps nowhere else, the place accorded to the Kshatriyas and consequently to action, while subordinate, as it should normally be, is nevertheless very far from negligible, since it comprises all that can be called the visible power. Besides, as we have already noted on another occasion, those who, under the influence of the false interpretations fashionable in the West, might doubt this very real, though relative, importance accorded to action by Hindu doctrines, as well as by other traditional doctrines, need only refer to the Bhagavad Gita to be convinced otherwise. For we must not forget that this work can only be rightly understood if we recall that it is one of those especially destined for the use of Kshatriyas. The Brahmins have only to exercise an, as it were, invisible authority which as such may be unknown to the vulgar, but which is nonetheless the immediate principle of all visible power. Being like the pivot around which all contingent things turn, the fixed axis around which the world accomplishes its revolution, the pole or the immutable center that directs and regulates the cosmic movement without participating therein. The dependence of the temporal power on the spiritual authority has its visible sign in the anointing of kings, who are not truly legitimized until they have received investiture and consecration from the hands of the priesthood, implying the transmission of a spiritual influence necessary for the regular exercise of their functions. This influence has at times manifested itself outwardly with distinctly perceptible effects, and we can cite as example of this the healing power of the kings of France, which was indeed directly connected to their anointing, for the influence in question was not transmitted to the king by his predecessor, but received only by virtue of this anointing, which shows clearly that this influence does not belong properly to the king, but is conferred on him by a kind of delegation of the spiritual authority, in which, as we indicated above, the divine right truly consists. The king, then, is merely a depository of this influence, and consequently can lose it in certain circumstances, which explains why in the Christendom of the Middle Ages the Pope could release subjects from their oath of allegiance to their sovereign. Moreover, in the Catholic tradition, Saint Peter is depicted holding in his hands not only the golden key of sacerdotal power, but also the silver key of royal power. For the ancient Romans, these two keys were an attribute of Janus, signifying the keys to the greater mysteries and the lesser mysteries, which, as we have explained, also correspond respectively to sacerdotal and royal initiation. Here it should be noted that Janus represents the common source of the two powers, whereas Saint Peter is properly the incarnation of the sacerdotal power, the two keys being transferred to him because it is through his intermediation that the royal power is transmitted, whereas the sacerdotal power is itself received directly from the source. What has just been said defines the normal relationships between spiritual authority and temporal power, and if these relationships were everywhere and always observed, no conflict would ever arise between them. For each would occupy its own proper place in the hierarchy of functions and beings, a hierarchy that, we stress again, conforms strictly to the very nature of things. Unfortunately, this is far from always being the case, and this normal relationship is only too often misunderstood and even inverted. Here it is first of all important to note that it is already a grave error simply to consider the spiritual and the temporal as two correlative or complementary terms, and to lose sight of the fact that the latter finds its principle in the former. This error can arise all the more easily since, from a certain point of view, as we have already said, the consideration of their complementarism also has its raison d'être, at least when the two powers are considered in their state of division, where one is no longer the supreme and ultimate principle of the other, but only its immediate principle, which as such is still relative. As we have explained elsewhere, regarding knowledge and action, this complementarity is not false, but only insufficient, for it corresponds to a still exterior point of view, as indeed does the very division of these two powers, made necessary by a state of the world in which the unique and supreme power is no longer within the reach of ordinary humanity. One could even say that when they are differentiated, the two powers inevitably first appear in their normal relationship of subordination, and that they are seen as correlatives only in a later historical phase of the cycle's descent. It is to this new phase that certain symbolic expressions, particularly emphasizing the aspect of complementarity, correspond, although a correct interpretation could show that they also indicate the relationship of subordination. Such is the case of the well-known, but in the West little understood, parable of the blind man and the lame man, which, in one of its principal meanings, actually represents the relationship between the active life and the contemplative life. Action left to itself is blind, and the essential immutability of knowledge is expressed outwardly by an immobility comparable to that of the lame man. The point of view of complementarity is represented by the mutual aid of the two men, each compensating by his own faculties for what is lacking in the other. And if the origin of this parable, or at least this particular application of it, is to be related to Confucianism, it is easy to see that the latter must confine itself to this point of view by the very fact that it is itself confined exclusively to the human and social order. We must note, apropos of this, that in China the distinction between Taoism, which is a purely metaphysical doctrine, and Confucianism, which is a social doctrine, both proceeding moreover from the same integral tradition, which represents their common principle, corresponds very exactly to the distinction between the spiritual and the temporal. Now, I would interject at this point that I disagree respectfully with Monsieur Guénon that Confucianism should be regarded as a purely social doctrine, although he doesn't say so explicitly here. I think that's what's implied. Anyway, regarding continuing with the text. And we should add that the importance of non-action from the Taoist point of view particularly justifies the symbolism employed in the fable in question for whomever looks at it from the outside. We should, however, carefully note that it is the lame man who plays the leading role in the association of the two men, and that his very position, mounted on the blind man's shoulders, symbolizes the superiority of contemplation over action, a superiority that Confucius himself was far from disputing in principle, as is shown in an account of his meeting with Lao Tzu, preserved by the historian Sima Qian, in which he admitted that he was not born to knowledge, that is, that he had not attained knowledge par excellence, which is knowledge of the purely metaphysical order, and which, as we said above, by its very nature belongs exclusively to those who possess true spiritual authority. If, then, it is an error to envisage the spiritual and the temporal merely as correlatives, there is an even graver error which consists in claiming to subordinate the spiritual to the temporal, that is to say, knowledge to action. This error, which completely reverses the normal relationship, corresponds to the tendency that generally characterizes the modern West, and it can obviously occur only in a period of very advanced intellectual decadence. In our time, moreover, some go yet further in this direction, even as far as to deny the very value of knowledge as such, and also, proceeding quite logically, for the two things are closely linked, to the negation pure and simple of all spiritual authority. This last degree of degeneration, which implies domination of the lowest castes, is one of the characteristics of the final phase of the Kali Yuga. If we consider religion in particular, since this is the special form that the spiritual takes in the Western world, this reversal of relations can be expressed in the following way. Instead of regarding the entire social order as deriving from religion, as being suspended from it, so to speak, and finding its principle therein, as was the case in medieval Christendom, and as it was equally in Islam, which is quite similar to it in this respect. Today people see religion at most only as one element of the social order, one element among others of equal value. This is the enslavement of the spiritual to the temporal, even its absorption by it, pending the inevitable complete negation. To consider things in this way amounts perforce to humanizing religion, that is, to treating religion as a purely human fact of the social order, or better still, of the sociological or psychological order, depending on one's preference. In truth, this is no longer religion, for religion essentially includes something suprahuman, lacking which we are no longer in the spiritual domain, for the temporal and the human are essentially identical, as we explained earlier. Thus, we have here a veritable implicit negation of religion and the spiritual, whatever the appearances may be, a negation such that the explicit and avowed negation will amount less to the establishment of a new order than simply to the recognition of a fait accompli. In this way, the reversal of relations prepare directly for the suppression of the superior term, something it already implies, at least virtually, just as the revolt of the Kshatriyas against the authority of the Brahmins prepares for and summons, as it were, the ascendancy of the lowest castes, as we shall see. And those who have followed us this far will easily understand that there is something more in this parallel than a simple comparison. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description.